item 10, and that is the Hobsonville Corridor Plan Change. It's on page 35 of the agenda.
Happy to move, Mr. Chair.
Moved by Councillor Watson, seconded by Councillor Walker, and I'll just got Erin, and sorry, I don't have your name here.
Through the Chair, it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Roberts, Principal Planner, who is the planner involved in the preparation of the report and the plan change.
Thank you, Erin. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Erin, in your hands. Do you want to take us through it? We've read the material. I do have some questions of my own, but we'll let you present the material first, Erin.
Thank you. This plan change really has three fundamental elements to it. The first being the need to identify on the precinct plan map the indicative roading layout that Auckland Transport is seeking to achieve in the area that is known as Hobsonville Corridor. Through the unitary plan process, those indicative roads were removed by the hearings panel, and Auckland Transport sees that their inclusion assists them to work with the land developers as they subdivide to achieve the connections in the transport network that Auckland Transport are seeking, essentially to create a freight and traffic road that runs parallel to Hobsonville Road from the Brigham Creek interchange to a midpoint in Hobsonville. And secondly, we've had the issue emerge that Local Board Chair White referred to in terms of the urban design requirements along Hobsonville Road. So we've sought to introduce some standards that development will need to meet in terms of the height of buildings and setback from the Hobsonville Road corridor. Importantly, this only applies along Hobsonville Road, so in terms of the development in the interior of the site, the height limits are much larger for the types of light industrial activities we would expect to be developed there. So this is a very site-specific set of standards and only applies in the precinct and along Hobsonville Road. Thirdly, we've introduced some stormwater provisions that support the provisions of the unitary plan and take cognizance of essentially the lack of any downstream ability to manage stormwater. It drains straight into the Waitemata Harbour, and so our stormwater, our Healthy Waters people have provided some additional provisions around stormwater management specific to this particular precinct. Along the way, our thinking about how we manage precincts has evolved a bit, and so Lisa has undertaken some consequential amendments to the text to better stitch the precinct into the wider unitary plan. Now that we've had a chance to look at it, how it will sit with all of the zones, the region-wide rules and the overlays. So that's where we're at. Today we are seeking the committee's approval to publicly notify this for submissions, and following that we will notify further submissions and hear from submitters if there are any that wish to speak. So we will be undertaking that process following this if the recommendations are approved.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Lisa. Councillor Cooper.
One quick question. Thanks, Erin and Lisa. So now when the any consent applications are being considered, will it mean that it'll take into account the receiving environment when it's residential on the other side of the road, which we hadn't done in the past, which has resulted in the huge storage facility? Will these changes mean that will be a change in the assessment criteria in that regard?
Erin? Sorry.
Through the Chair, what we are suggesting in this plan change is that we impose some standards on development as opposed to assessment criteria. The standards mean that the applicants have to meet them or be subject to a more stringent resource consent. Initially, when we put the draft out for public feedback last year, we heard from the local board quite clearly that while the assessment criteria that were in that draft were welcome, they were seeking a stronger policy framework to apply along. And so the work has been done with Council's Auckland Design Office to establish the height of buildings and the setbacks required along Hobsonville Road.
And that will mitigate any shading that's
Yeah.
been carried.
And so shading diagrams were created
Right, yes,
to
I saw those.
establish
It's hard to understand
the
from a
height
layperson's
and
point of view. Thank you.
yes.
That's great.
Thank you. Members, I've put there in the C, I think there's a few things here that I would like to have a look at, and I don't want to interrogate them in detail here. There is mention in this report, and there should be, about good pedestrian access. There is actually there's not mention of the other active mode, cycle access, other than a reference to bike parking at one point. It concerns me also that there is mention in 3 pages, the promotion of slip lanes. Now, that's not what I see in the Roads and Streets Framework and the Transport Design Manual.
Terrible.
Slip lanes are something that are dangerous, and they cause absolute grief to active road users. So probably a question at this point, Erin, and also notices reference to Auckland Transport Code of Practice, which is in some ways been superseded by the Roads and Streets Framework and the Transport Design Manual, but that's not mentioned. There's some mention of bike parking, but it's restricted, I think, only to one part, and there's also mention of I think pedestrian access or connectivity to the town centres, schools, etc., but it doesn't suggest that the connections should be to the residential areas. So I'm wondering if at this stage, what is the status of AT-COP, the Code of Practice, and the Roads and Streets Framework and the Transport Design Manual, which don't appear to show here?
I'm not familiar with exactly where that's at, but we can amend the plan change to reflect the relevant documents. Yeah.
Okay, I think that is important, and I also think there's strong emphasis to the active modes, pedestrian and cycling. There's strong emphasis on pedestrian, but there's almost an entire absence of cycling connectivity here. Is there a reason for that?
No, there's no reason by our design. It may have been something that we've overlooked, so we can pick up that issue. In terms of the slip lane issue, that is really, we don't anticipate slip lanes on Hobsonville Road along the industrial, but there was where Hobsonville Village, where the current supermarket and retail centre is, there is a slip lane there that was negotiated through the Environment Court. That is built, and so this plan change retains those provisions, although they've actually been exercised through the resource consent and the development.
Yeah, the words are promote the provision of slip lanes.
Okay.
I personally think that's a very powerful incentive to actually deliver slip lanes.
Okay.
So members, look, rather than go further on the detail here, I'm wondering if you might be willing to, under the C, delegate to the Planning Committee Chair, Deputy Chair. I'm happy if we can include one of the councillors that are moving, Councillor and Councillor Watson, and the Manager Planning North, to just pick up a few of those small points that I'm raising. Are you willing to accept that?
Yeah.
Councillor Watson? Councillor Walker?
Well, just an observation, Mr. Chair, and that is, in many instances, a wider footpath would suffice for cycling rather than a complete cycleway. So I just make that observation, and I think that is a change that Auckland Transport need to take on board.
Okay, thank you. It's moved and seconded. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Lisa. No further questions. Any comments, members? It is ready for debate. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Thank you. We'll go to item